Hopping into Cinema 4D, we're going to make an Icicle asset. So first I'm going to drag in the face mesh as an FBX. That way we can get all the sizing right. And because we're going to be working right at the origin where the nose is, I'm going to go ahead and hide the work plane and the world axis. And an icicle is pretty much cylindrical. So I'll click here and hold, and then go to cylinder. Hit T to scale and scale this down. And I'm going to want the origin of the icicle, the axis origin, to be right at the top. So when we place it somewhere, it'll hang down properly. So I'll just scoot this down, make it a little bit more narrow, and I'll hit NB to show the wireframe. And to taper this object, we can actually just use a taper. And holding shift, that'll make it a child of the cylinder. And then in strength, we can just turn this up. And as you can see, it's upside down. So I'll hit R for rotate, and then drag this all the way around, and then hold shift to snap it. Now I have a nice tapering going on. And right now the tapering is curved. So selecting this again, we can turn the curvature down so it's more straight. And we're going to add some kind of bumpiness detail to this. So in the cylinder, I'm going to turn up the height segments a few. And we can turn the rotation segments down. I think 10 or even 8 could do. Maybe let's stick with 10. So now we have a general icicle shape. I think making it a little bit more narrow might be good. Now I'm going to middle click the cylinder to select both it and its child, and then merge these together. That way it collapses everything, and now we can edit the actual edges. So in edge mode, I'm just going to select some of these edges and either make them bigger or smaller just to add a little bit of variety to this contour. And now let's add a Displacer Deformer. And again, holding shift to make it a child. And in shading, under shader, we'll add a noise texture. And then back in the object, we want to turn this height down quite a bit, just so it's enough to affect it a little bit. Looks like even 0.2 is enough. And back in the shading tab under noise, we can change the style of noise. I'll just click this and click out, and then hit the down arrow to cycle through a few. And any of them should do. It looks like Zada for me is working nicely. It just gives it a little bit of lumpiness. Now again, I'll middle click and collapse these. And when I say collapse, I'm using a connect objects and delete, which I have saved up in here, but you can just right click and go to connect objects and delete down here. And now again, with the edge tool selected, I'll just make a few adjustments. I think that looks good. The top here though, because most of the time we're going to be applying it to the face, and the face is a pretty vertical object, and right now this plane up here is pretty horizontal. So first we can just, with the faces tool selected, I'm going to hit O to rectangularly select this and delete. And then back in the edge tool, I'll double click this edge, switch over to the side view by middle clicking, and I'll rotate this just so it'll kind of match the face more. And then hitting T to scale, and I'll increase this, and then E, and just kind of move it over. This way, when we stick it to the face, it kind of has a little bit of room to grab onto. And to make this fit even better, I think we should give it a little bit more curvature. So I'll reset the PSR of this just so it's straight. And I'll scoot this out and make it almost totally vertical. And then I'll just drag these a little bit just to even out that curve. Now you can see the pivot is here. So hitting L, we can enable this axis mode. And then just drag this up and put it in the center here. So now when we reset the PSR and make sure this is off, it'll just kind of stick right on there. So we'll be able to apply it to the nose, on the cheeks, and everything hopefully will line up well enough. I might even narrow this a bit so it's not so wide. And I'll change the name from cylinder to icicle. And before we texture it, we need to unwrap it. So I'm going to switch over to the UV edit mode. And as usual, I'll make sure all the edges are selected. Go to projection, frontal, and that'll just grab the whole thing. And then I can just switch over to the edge mode. And in either view, you can select the edges that you want to cut on. And then over here, click UV unwrap. And that does a pretty good job. It looks like that matches the shape of this, so I think we're good there. And to double check, we can always go to textures and see the UV map and just check for any stretching or deformation. I guess one thing to make this a little bit better would be to make this level. So with all these selected, I'll hit R for rotate and just kind of straighten that out. T for scale, and then E for translation, and I'll just center it here. Now switching back to the startup normal mode. And just to double check the UVs, on this UV tag here, I can hold Shift and double click, and it'll bring up this UV window. And we can see that it looks good. So now with the icicle selected, I'll go to File, Export Selected Objects, and export in FBX. Now we'll hop straight over to Substance Painter. And then I can simply drag this FBX directly into the viewport. And we can work in 1024 resolution, and all the other defaults look good. And to start, I'm just going to save this right away. Now for this overall material, we're going to keep things pretty simple. So we're going to start with a dark blue color by adding a fill layer here. And we can delete this empty layer. Under base color, I'll switch it to a dark blue. And then make another fill layer, right click and add a black mask. That makes this layer invisible. And selecting this icon here selects the layer. This is the mask and this is the layer. So we'll change this to a light blue color. And now with the mask selected, we'll paint on the detail that we want of the lighter pieces, just to make it look a little icy. So down here in brushes, we can just select any of these brushes that's kind of rough and maybe crystalline looking. This brush here actually has some nice cracks to it, so I'm just going to paint on a few cracks to start. And for the rest of it, I'm just going to make the brush really tiny, and I'll just go around and paint the details on pretty manually. So now we have that frosty layer looking okay. Let's add one more fill layer. We'll make this bright white. Right click and add another black mask. And this one, I'm going to make the brush even smaller. And now we're going to paint on the finer details. And a smarter way to do this would be to switch over to the 2D view. and then change the mode to base color. And that way I can just draw straight across here. Now here I'm just using the smudge tool just to soften up these lines I drew. Now that looks good for the color. We just need to add some opacity to this top part so that it blends better. So under texture set settings in channels, it looks like opacity is already set on there. Otherwise we could have added it through here. So none of these layers need to have opacity set because we'll do it all in one layer. So by selecting these layers, I'm just turning off the opacity channel on these layers, and then I'll add one final layer, and this will only have opacity. So all of the opacity will just come from the single layer. And we want it that the opacity is set to 1 where it's visible. So we'll add a white mask, and then we'll just paint black where we want it to be transparent. So grabbing any brush really, I'm just going to paint black on this top section here. So make sure to switch back to the brush tool and set the color to black and change the brush to something with maybe a teeny bit of texture. And if you can't see what's going on, make sure you're in the normal material mode, or in this case, I think we just need to see opacity. Now you can see for the opacity channel, this will fade off really nicely as it attaches to the face. So to export this, we'll go to File, Export Textures, and we'll use the Spark Air Studio preset. Make sure it's set to 1024. Or in our case, because these will be pretty small, we can get away with 512. So we'll start there. And then hit export. And to see the files, we can just click Open Output Directory up here and take a look. Now it looks like everything worked, but we didn't get the opacity channel out there. You can see on the diffuse, there's no alpha embedded in here, so we need to go back in and make sure we grab that opacity. And I have this preset set to color only with RGBA under the color. So I can just go and choose that and then export this again. Okay, that didn't work because I forgot one small little step. When you're looking at opacity, you don't want to see the checkerboard. You want to see black where you want it to be transparent. So I'm going to add one more layer, just throw it on the bottom, turn everything else off but opacity. And for this one, we'll set the opacity to black. Now we have a proper opacity channel here. And it looks like I missed a little bit on the edge, so I'll just paint that out real quick. So now when we export, this should be embedded in that color channel. Now, as you can see, we have an alpha channel in our color. And because we're not using ORM, normal, or emissive, we can just delete these. And we'll just use this diffuse. And to double check it, we can drag it directly onto this icicle in Cinema 4D. And make sure everything is mapped properly. And it looks good. And to see it at full res, just select that material, go to viewport, texture preview size to 1K or no scaling. And to double check the alpha, double click on the material, drag this image into alpha and release over texture. Turn this on. And there you go, looks good. And because we already exported the FBX and now we have the texture, we don't have to export anything else out of Cinema. So we can shut that down. And next we'll add that to the Spark AR scene.